Katie Morris had been a field nurse for 3 years now, and she had seen enough combat to last a lifetime. She worked at the forward base on Epsilon Prime, a rocky planet on the edge of human territory, where 5 different alien species worked together with humans to stop the Zeth raids. The base was always busy with soldiers coming and going, and Katie spent most of her days in the medical tent checking injuries and keeping everyone healthy. She was good at her job, but the alien soldiers never seemed to notice. To them, she was just a small human woman who fixed cuts and handed out medicine. Nothing special, nothing worth respecting. The Kryn were the worst about it. They stood over 8 feet tall with scales like armor and muscles that could bend steel bars. Their commander Vresh would walk past Katie without even looking at her, as if she was invisible. The Vex were bug-like creatures with sharp claws, and they clicked their mandibles in what Katie had learned was laughter whenever they saw her carrying medical supplies. The Dulmar had 4 arms and could lift incredible weights, and they made jokes in their language about how weak humans looked. The Torgash were like giant bears with thick fur, and they simply ignored the human medical staff completely. Among all these powerful alien warriors, Katie looked tiny and fragile. She was 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed barely 140 pounds. Her uniform always seemed too big on her frame, and when she walked through the base carrying her medical bag, aliens would step aside, but not out of respect. Out of amusement. Colonel Jack Hayes was different, though. He commanded the human forces at the base, and he treated Katie and her medical team with the same respect he gave his combat officers. He would stop by the medical tent every morning to check on the staff and ask if they needed anything. He made sure they had the best equipment, and he always backed them up when alien commanders complained about human medical protocols. Katie appreciated that more than she could say. Most commanders saw medics as support staff, barely worth noticing, but Hayes understood that keeping soldiers alive was just as important as fighting. Maybe more important. The base sat on a ridge overlooking a valley that stretched for miles. Beyond the valley was Zeth territory, and everyone knew the enemy was planning something big. Scouts reported movement in the hills and supply convoys heading toward the border. Intelligence said an attack was coming, but nobody knew when or where it would hit. The tension at the base grew thicker every day. Soldiers cleaned their weapons more often. Patrols went out heavier armed. Even the alien commanders seemed nervous, though they tried to hide it. Katie went about her routine despite the tension. She organized medical supplies, trained new medics who arrived from Earth, and ran drills to make sure everyone knew what to do if casualties started coming in. She kept her own gear ready, too. Her medical pack was always stocked, and her sidearm was always cleaned and loaded. She had learned in her first tour that being prepared meant the difference between life and death. Not just for her, but for everyone she might need to save. The other nurses sometimes asked her why she was so intense about it. Katie never explained that she had seen too many soldiers die because a medic was not ready fast enough. She just stayed prepared and hoped she would never need to prove why. The alien commanders held briefings every few days, and Colonel Hayes always attended. Katie did not go to these meetings because medical staff was not considered essential personnel for tactical planning. She heard about them secondhand from the human soldiers who did attend. According to them, the alien commanders spent most of the time arguing about the best way to defend the base. The Kryn wanted to meet any attack head-on with brute force. The Vex preferred setting traps and using tactics. The Dulmar thought they should call for more reinforcements. The Torgash just wanted to fortify the base and wait. Colonel Hayes usually suggested a balanced approach, but the aliens rarely listened to him. They saw humans as the weakest link in the coalition, barely capable of holding their own in a real fight. Katie heard the comments. She heard alien soldiers joke about how humans needed machines and vehicles to do what other species could do with their natural strength. She heard them wonder out loud why humans were even included in the coalition. She heard Vresh tell another Kryn officer that the human medical staff was a waste of resources because any real warrior should be able to fight through injuries. It made her angry, but she kept quiet. Getting into arguments with alien commanders would not help anyone. Instead, she focused on her job and waited for the day when she could prove them all wrong. That day came sooner than anyone expected. Colonel Hayes assembled a patrol to investigate reports of Zeth scouts in the hills south of the base. It was supposed to be a routine mission, just 30 soldiers moving through the rocks to gather intelligence and maybe chase off any enemy scouts they found. 10 humans would go along with 20 alien soldiers from the 4 other species. Hayes announced that Katie would accompany them as the patrol medic. Commander Vresh immediately objected. He said that bringing a human nurse on a combat patrol was foolish. He said she would slow them down. He said that if anyone got injured, the alien soldiers were tough enough to make it back to base without help. Colonel Hayes listened to all the objections and then said simply that Katie was coming and that was final. His word carried weight even among the aliens, so Vresh stopped arguing, but Katie could see the disgust in his reptilian eyes. The patrol left at dawn. Katie checked her gear one more time before they moved out. Medical pack, sidearm, water, energy bars, and her communication radio. Everything was in place. She fell in with the human soldiers near the middle of the formation, while the Kryn took point and the Vex spread out on the flanks. The Dulmar carried the heavy weapons and the Torgash brought up the rear. They moved through the rocky terrain in standard formation, weapons ready, eyes scanning for threats. The morning was cool and quiet. Too quiet, Katie thought, but she kept that feeling to herself. The patrol moved deeper into the hills for 6 hours without seeing anything suspicious. The terrain was rough with loose rocks and steep slopes that made walking difficult. Katie kept pace with the others despite carrying her heavy medical pack. She had trained for this, hiking with weight until her legs stopped burning and her breathing stayed steady. Some of the alien soldiers glanced back at her occasionally, probably expecting her to fall behind, but she never did. She just kept walking, conserving her energy and watching the hills around them. Commander Vresh led from the front with his Kryn warriors. They were impressive to watch, moving over the rough ground like it was nothing, their powerful legs eating up distance. The Vex scouts had spread out wide, using their natural speed to check the flanks. Katie could barely see them moving through the rocks like shadows. The Dulmar carried the squad weapons without any visible effort, their forearms making the heavy guns look like toys. Even the Torgash at the rear seemed completely at ease, their thick bodies built for endurance. Among all of them, the humans looked almost fragile, but Katie knew looks could be deceiving. Colonel Hayes walked near the middle of the formation with the human soldiers. He was a big man, over 6 feet tall and heavily muscled from years of military training. At 50 years old, he was still in better shape than soldiers half his age. He had a presence that made people listen when he spoke, and a tactical mind that had saved countless lives over his 20-year career. Katie respected him more than any officer she had ever served under. He treated his people right, and he never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. That kind of leadership was rare. The attack came without warning. One moment the patrol was moving through a narrow valley between 2 ridges, and the next moment the world exploded. Plasma fire erupted from 3 sides at once, bright bolts of superheated energy that tore through the formation. The Vex Point scout died instantly, his body cut in half by concentrated fire. 2 Kryn warriors went down in the first seconds. A Dulmar soldier screamed as plasma burned through his armor. The patrol scattered, trying to find cover, but the enemy had planned this perfectly. They were in a kill zone with nowhere to go. Katie hit the ground hard, her training taking over before her mind even processed what was happening. She rolled behind a boulder and pressed herself flat as plasma bolts scorched the air above her. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her hands were steady. She looked around quickly, assessing the situation. Wounded soldiers everywhere. The patrol was pinned down by fire from elevated positions. The enemy had them surrounded on 3 sides. This was bad. This was very bad. She heard someone screaming nearby and crawled toward the sound. A human private named Danny Coleman had taken a plasma bolt to his left leg. The wound was terrible, burned through flesh and bone, bleeding heavily. Danny was trying to crawl to cover, but he was not going to make it. Katie moved fast, keeping low, and grabbed his vest. She dragged him behind a larger rock, plasma fire tracking her movement. One bolt passed so close she felt the heat on her face. She got Danny to safety and immediately started working on his leg. Biofoam to seal the wound, painkiller injection, tourniquet above the injury. Her hands moved automatically through the procedures she had practiced 1,000 times. Colonel Hayes was rallying the survivors, shouting orders over the chaos of battle. The humans returned fire while trying to establish a defensive perimeter. The Kryn warriors used their natural armor to absorb hits while advancing on enemy positions. The remaining Vex tried to flank around, but the enemy had too many guns. Plasma fire came in waves, precise and overwhelming. This was not a random ambush. The Zeth had planned this down to the last detail. Katie moved from one wounded soldier to another, crawling through dirt and rocks while plasma bolts burned the air around her. A Dulmar with 2 arms shredded by plasma fire. She stabilized him. A Torgash with burns across his chest. She treated him. Another human with a head wound. She bandaged him. Her medical pack was getting lighter as she used supplies, but the casualties kept coming. The patrol was being torn apart. She was working on a Kryn warrior when she heard the sound that changed everything. A heavy thud like someone dropping a sack of grain. She looked up and saw Colonel Hayes 20 meters away, collapsed on the ground, clutching his chest. He had been hit. Katie could see blood spreading across his uniform. Her mind calculated distances and angles automatically. Hayes was in the open, exposed to enemy fire. The nearest soldier to him was a Kryn named Grenix. But Grenix was pinned behind cover and showed no signs of moving to help the colonel. Katie looked at the open ground between her position and Hayes. It was 20 meters of kill zone, completely exposed to enemy fire from the ridge above. Going out there was suicide. Every combat instinct she had told her to stay put, stay alive, wait for the situation to change. But Hayes was dying. She could see it in the way he had fallen, in the amount of blood spreading around him. He had maybe minutes before he bled out, maybe less. She did not think about it anymore. She pulled a smoke grenade from her vest, yanked the pin and threw it into the space between her and Hayes. The grenade popped and gray smoke billowed out, providing concealment. Not much, but some. Katie took 3 deep breaths and then she ran. She sprinted across the kill zone, zigzagging like they had taught her in training. Plasma bolts cut through the smoke around her. One passed so close it burned her sleeve. Another hit the ground at her feet and the explosion threw rocks into her legs. She did not stop. She ran harder, closing the distance, and dove the last few meters like a baseball player sliding into home plate. She reached Hayes just as the smoke started to thin. He was conscious, but barely. His eyes were unfocused and his breathing came in short gasps. The plasma bolt had hit him in the upper chest below his armor plate. The wound was bad, bleeding fast, burning deep into tissue. Katie had seconds to act before enemy fire found them both. She grabbed her medical pack and started working. Katie positioned herself next to Hayes and tried to remember everything she had learned about casualty carries. The fireman's carry was designed for this, one person carrying another over distance, but it was meant for short evacuations. 100 meters maybe. 200 if you were strong and desperate. Not 2 miles. Never 2 miles. But it was the only method that would work. She had to get Hayes onto her shoulders and keep him there. She had to balance his weight and move efficiently. She had to ignore pain and fatigue and doubt. She had to become something more than human. Or maybe she had to become exactly human, because humans had always done impossible things when people they cared about were dying. She took 3 deep breaths and tried to calm her racing heart. Sergeant Palmer was getting his diversion ready. The other soldiers were preparing for one last violent push to draw enemy attention. Katie had maybe 5 minutes before Hayes died from his injuries. Maybe less. She could not afford to think about failure. She could not afford to doubt. She just had to move. She bent down and worked Hayes into position. She got her shoulder under his midsection and grabbed his arm with one hand and his leg with the other. Then she stood up. The weight was crushing. Hayes was solid muscle and bone, 210 pounds of dead weight that pressed down on her shoulders like the world itself. Katie's legs almost buckled immediately. Her back screamed in protest. Her shoulders felt like they were being crushed. She took 1 step and her knees nearly gave out. She took another step and her vision went gray at the edges. This was impossible. Her body was telling her this was impossible. Every nerve was screaming at her to put him down, to stop, to accept that some things could not be done. Katie told her body to shut up and took another step. Then another. Palmer's diversion kicked off with a massive barrage of fire. Every gun the humans had opened up at once, pouring plasma and bullets toward the eastern side of the enemy position. Grenades exploded on the ridge. The Zeth forces shifted to respond to the threat. Katie used the chaos to move. She carried Hayes into the rock corridor and started west. 1 step, then another, creating a rhythm. Right foot, left foot, breathe, right foot, left foot, breathe. Do not think about the distance. Do not think about the weight. Just focus on the next step. The first 100 meters were pure hell. Katie's muscles burned with lactic acid buildup. Her lungs heaved trying to get enough oxygen. Her legs trembled with every step. The weight on her shoulders felt like it was increasing, getting heavier with each meter. Sweat poured down her face and soaked her uniform. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel. She could only see the ground directly in front of her feet. The world reduced to rocks and dirt and the next place to put her foot down. Nothing else existed. Nothing else mattered. Just the next step. She had trained for endurance. 3 years of combat deployments had hardened her body in ways that normal life never could. She had marched 20 miles with a full pack. She had worked 30-hour shifts in field hospitals without stopping. She had gone days without real sleep during major offensives. Her body knew how to suffer. Her mind knew how to push past pain. But this was different. This was carrying another human being, a life that depended entirely on her not failing. The weight was not just physical. It was the weight of responsibility, of debt, of loyalty. It was the weight of proving that humans were not weak, that nurses were not helpless, that she was not just a small woman who could be dismissed and ignored. At 200 meters, Katie stumbled and nearly fell. She caught herself against a rock wall, gasping, her entire body shaking. Hayes stirred slightly on her shoulders, mumbling something incoherent. Katie checked his pulse by pressing her fingers against his wrist while he was still draped over her. Weak but steady. The biofoam was holding. He was still alive. She gave him another injection of stabilizer, using her last dose. Now he had to make it because she had nothing left to keep him going. She adjusted his weight on her shoulders, found a slightly better position and pushed off from the wall. Her legs responded barely, but they moved. She kept walking. The terrain was brutal. The corridor through the rocks led downward at first, which helped because gravity was working with her instead of against her. But then it climbed again, a steep slope covered in loose stones. Katie had to watch every step to avoid falling. Her legs were rubber now, barely responding to her commands. She fell twice, managing to twist her body both times so Hayes took less impact. The second fall scraped her shoulder raw against the rocks. She felt blood running down her arm. She got back up and kept moving. There was no other choice. Stopping meant dying. Dying meant Hayes died. Hayes dying was not acceptable. Therefore she kept moving. The logic was simple, even if the execution was impossible. At half a mile, Katie's body started sending shutdown signals. Her vision was graying out completely. Her legs were not just weak anymore, they were failing. Her back felt like someone had driven hot nails through her spine. The voice in her head that regulated survival was screaming at her to stop. That voice was designed to keep her alive by preventing her from pushing past the point of permanent damage. Every species had that voice. It was biological law. You could not override it, except humans could. Humans had evolved something unique, a conscious override that let them push past any limit if they decided the reason was good enough. Katie decided the reason was good enough. She told that voice in her head to shut up, and she kept walking. The world had reduced to a very simple place. There was the weight on her shoulders. There was the ground under her feet. There was the next step. Nothing else existed anymore. Not the battle behind her. Not the base ahead. Not even the pain. Just the next step. Katie had entered a state beyond normal human limits, a place where her conscious mind had taken complete control over her body and simply refused to accept failure. Athletes called it the zone. Soldiers called it second wind. Combat medics called it doing your damn job because people were dying. Whatever the name, it was real, and Katie was deep in it now. Her body was breaking down, but her mind would not let it stop. Not yet, not until Hayes was safe. Katie's hands moved fast, faster than she had ever worked before. She ripped open Hayes's uniform to expose the wound. Plasma burns were different from bullet wounds, cauterizing as they cut but also cooking the tissue around them. The damage went deep. She could see his lung was compromised from the way he was breathing. Blood filled the wound cavity despite the burning. This was critical. This was as bad as it got. She grabbed biofoam from her pack and sprayed it directly into the wound. The foam expanded and hardened, sealing the injury and stopping the bleeding. Hayes gasped as the foam filled the damaged tissue. Katie knew it hurt like hell, but there was no time for gentle treatment. She injected him with a cocktail of medications. Painkiller to keep him conscious but functional, stimulant to keep his heart pumping, clotting agent to help his blood work with the biofoam. Her training was automatic now, her hands doing what they had been trained to do while her mind raced ahead to the next problem. The smoke was clearing fast. Plasma fire would find them any second. Katie looked around desperately for better cover. There was a larger rock formation 10 meters away, big enough to hide behind. She had to move Hayes, and she had to do it now. She grabbed him under the arms and started dragging him backward. Hayes was a big man, over 210 pounds with his gear on. Katie weighed 140. Moving him should have been impossible, but she did not think about that. She just pulled, using her legs and back, sliding him across the rocky ground. Plasma bolts started hitting around them. One struck the ground right where Hayes had been lying a second before. 2 human soldiers saw what she was doing and broke cover to help. Together, they dragged Hayes behind the larger rocks. Katie immediately checked his vitals again. Pulse was weak but steady. Breathing was labored but functional. The biofoam was holding. He was stable for now, but he needed surgery. Real surgery in a real medical facility. He would not last more than an hour without it. Sergeant Chris Palmer, the senior surviving human, crawled over to Katie. His face was covered in dirt and his uniform was torn, but he was still fighting. He looked at Hayes and then at Katie, and she could see the question in his eyes before he asked it. "How bad is it?" Katie just shook her head. "Bad, really bad." Palmer understood. He turned away and started assessing their tactical situation, and it was not good. The patrol was scattered across the kill zone, pinned down by enemy fire from elevated positions. The Zeth had at least 40 soldiers up on those ridges, maybe more. The patrol was down to maybe 20 effectives, and several of those were wounded. Their communications officer was dead, and the long-range radio was destroyed in the first seconds of the ambush. They could not call for help. They could not retreat because the enemy controlled all the high ground. They were trapped. Katie looked at the surviving soldiers around her. The Kryn were strong, but they were taking heavy casualties. Their natural armor could absorb a lot, but concentrated plasma fire was burning through it. The Dulmar were tough, but 2 of them were already dead and the others were wounded. The Torgash were holding the rear, but they were running out of ammunition. The humans were doing their best, but they were just humans. No natural advantages, just training and determination. It was not enough. They were going to die here unless something changed. She looked at Colonel Hayes lying pale and still against the rocks. He had saved her career once, back on her first tour when she had made a mistake that could have gotten people killed. He had covered for her, trained her, made her into the medic she was today. She owed him everything. She was not going to let him die in this forgotten valley on this forgotten planet. She was going to get him out of here no matter what it took. Katie looked at the ridge above them where the Zeth were firing from. Through a gap in the rock, she could see something that made her heart jump. A Zeth communications array, still intact, still operational. It was positioned on a small plateau about 50 meters up the ridge. If she could reach that array, she could call for help. She could bring in air support. She could save everyone. But getting to that array meant climbing 50 meters of exposed rock face while under fire. It meant leaving Hayes here with the others. It meant probably dying in the attempt. Katie calculated the odds, and they were terrible. Maybe 1 chance in 10 of making it, maybe less. Then she looked around at the defensive position again and saw something else. The rocks they were hiding behind formed a natural corridor that led west, away from the heaviest enemy fire. It was not perfect cover, but it was something. If she could get Hayes into that corridor, if she could carry him through it, she could circle around the enemy position and head back toward the base. It was 2 miles to the base. 2 miles through rough terrain. 2 miles while carrying a 210-pound man. Katie had never carried anything that heavy for more than a few meters in training. 2 miles was impossible. Completely impossible. But staying here was certain death. Trying to reach the comm array was almost certain death. Carrying Hayes out was only mostly certain death. Those were better odds. Katie made her decision. She crawled over to Sergeant Palmer and explained her plan. Palmer looked at her like she had lost her mind. He told her she would never make it. He told her Hayes was too heavy. He told her the terrain was too rough. He told her the enemy would hunt her down. Katie listened to all his objections, and then she said simply that she was doing it anyway. Someone had to try. Someone had to get Hayes out. It might as well be her. Palmer studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded. He understood. He had seen that look before in soldiers who had made peace with dying, but were going to complete their mission anyway. He asked what she needed. Katie told him to create a diversion. Pull enemy attention to the east side of the position. Give her 5 minutes to get Hayes into the corridor and start moving. Palmer said he could do that. He gathered the other human soldiers and explained the plan. They all looked at Katie with a mixture of respect and pity. They were going to cover her escape, but they did not think she would make it either. Katie prepared Hayes for movement. She stripped all his non-essential gear. Ammunition pouches, grenades, anything that added weight but was not critical. She kept his armor because removing it would take too long and expose his wounds. She kept his sidearm because he might need it if he regained consciousness. She redistributed her own gear, dumping everything except medical essentials, water, her weapon, and one smoke grenade. Every ounce mattered now. Every ounce was going to make the difference between making it and collapsing halfway. Katie did not know how long she had been walking. Time had stopped meaning anything. There was only the endless repetition of steps, the crushing weight on her shoulders, and the determination to keep moving. Her body had gone beyond pain into a numb state where she could feel things breaking down, but could not quite process what it meant. Something in her back had torn. She could feel it. Something in her left knee was damaged. She could feel that too. Her shoulders were raw and bleeding where Hayes's weight had ground through her uniform and into her skin. None of it mattered. Pain was just information, and she was choosing to ignore that information. She hit the 1-mile mark without realizing it. The terrain had shifted from rocky corridors to open ground with scattered trees. This was more dangerous because she was exposed, but also easier because she could see where she was going. The base was maybe a mile ahead now, maybe less. She could see smoke on the horizon from the base's generators. So close. But a mile was still forever when every step was agony. Her legs were barely lifting anymore, just shuffling forward. Her breathing had become ragged and desperate. Her vision was reduced to a small circle directly in front of her. Everything else was gray fog. She stumbled, and this time she could not catch herself. She went down hard, managing at the last second to twist so she landed on her side instead of on Hayes. The impact knocked the wind out of her. She lay there for a moment, gasping, unable to move. Hayes rolled off her shoulders and lay next to her on the ground. Katie forced herself to check him. His pulse was weaker. His breathing was more labored. The biofoam was starting to break down. He had maybe 30 minutes left. Maybe less. She looked at the smoke on the horizon. So close. She tried to stand and her legs would not respond. They were done. They had given everything they had and there was nothing left. She tried again and managed to get to her knees. That was progress. She rested there for a moment on her hands and knees, trying to gather strength that did not exist. Then she heard it. The distinctive hiss-click of Zeth communication devices. Enemy scouts had found her trail. Katie forced her head up and looked back. 3 Zeth soldiers were moving through the trees about 50 meters behind her, following her path. They had not seen her yet, but they would in seconds. She had to move. She had to fight. She had to do something. Her hand went to her sidearm and she was surprised to find it still in her holster. She drew the weapon. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it. She checked the magazine. Half full. Enough. Katie used the last of her strength to drag Hayes behind a fallen tree. It was not much cover, but it was something. She positioned herself next to the tree and raised her weapon. Her vision was swimming, but she forced herself to focus. The Zeth scouts were closer now, moving carefully through the trees, weapons ready. They were good. Trained hunters. But Katie had one advantage. They thought they were tracking a wounded medic. They were not expecting a fight. She waited until they were 30 meters away. Then she opened fire. Her first 2 shots hit the lead scout's center mass. He went down. The other 2 scattered, bringing their weapons up. Katie put 3 rounds into the second scout before he could find cover. He dropped. The third scout got off a plasma burst that scorched the fallen tree inches from Katie's head. She felt the heat on her face. She returned fire, emptying her magazine at where the scout had been. There was a scream and then silence. Katie's hands were shaking too hard to reload. She just held the empty gun and waited to see if anyone else was coming. Nothing moved in the trees. The scouts were down. All 3 of them. Katie dropped her weapon and collapsed against the tree. She could not do this anymore. Her body was completely finished. She had nothing left. Not even fumes. Hayes was dying next to her and she could not save him. They were both going to die here, so close to safety that she could see it but too far to reach. She wanted to cry, but she was too dehydrated for tears. She wanted to scream, but she had no breath. She just sat there, broken and defeated, watching Hayes's chest rise and fall in shallow breaths. Then something inside her shifted. It was not strength. She had no strength left. It was not determination. She had pushed past determination miles ago. It was something else. Something fundamental to what humans were. It was the absolute refusal to quit. The inability to accept defeat even when defeat was certain. It was the core of human stubbornness that had let her species survive ice ages and plagues and wars and everything else the universe had thrown at them. It was the thing that made humans dangerous. Not their technology. Not their weapons. Their simple refusal to stop trying no matter what. Katie forced herself to eat an energy bar from her pack. It tasted like cardboard and she almost choked on it, but she got it down. She drank half her remaining water. She stretched her ruined muscles for 30 seconds, working through pain that would have made her scream if she had the energy. Then she positioned Hayes back on her shoulders. Her body screamed in protest. Her legs threatened to give out immediately. She ignored all of it and stood up. And then she started to run. It was not a real run. It was a shuffling, stumbling, barely faster than walking kind of movement that would have looked pathetic to anyone watching. But it was faster than walking, and speed was all that mattered now. Katie covered another quarter-mile in that terrible shuffling run before her body absolutely refused to continue. She dropped back to a walk but kept moving. The base was close now. Less than half a mile. She could see the perimeter walls. She could see guard towers. She could see salvation. She kept walking toward it, one step at a time, refusing to stop. Then she heard the sound that made her heart sink, the deep roar of engines. Zeth gunships coming fast from the northeast. The scouts she had killed must have called for support before she shot them. Now the gunships were coming to finish the job. Katie looked around desperately for cover. There was a small rise ahead with some rocks. Not much, but the best she was going to find. She carried Hayes up the rise and laid him down carefully behind the largest rock. She checked his vitals one more time. Weak. Very weak. He had maybe 10 minutes left. The gunships would be here in less than 2 minutes. Katie pulled out the device she had taken from one of the dead Zeth scouts. A communication unit. She had grabbed it without thinking, just reacting on instinct. Now that instinct might save them both. Katie's hands were shaking so badly she could barely work the controls on the Zeth communication device. She had been trained in alien technology. But this model was newer than anything she had seen before. The interface was different. The controls were in a language she did not read. But she understood the basics of radio communication, and most species use similar principles. She found what looked like the frequency control and started cycling through channels. The gunships were getting closer. She could see them now. 2 dark shapes against the sky, moving fast and low, maybe a minute away. She found a channel that crackled with human voices and almost sobbed with relief. She keyed the transmit button and spoke into the device. Her voice came out as a rasp, barely recognizable. Watchdog Actual, this is Medic 3, do you copy? Over, static, she tried again. Watchdog Actual, this is Lieutenant Katie Morris with critical casualty. Requesting immediate air support and evacuation. Transmitting coordinates now. Over. She did not actually know how to transmit coordinates with the Zeth device, so she just hoped they could track her signal. More static. Then a voice came through, distorted but understandable. Medic 3, this is Watchdog Actual. Confirm your identity and status, over. Katie recognized the voice. It was Major Peter Grant, the base operations officer. She gave her authentication code, a string of letters and numbers that proved she was who she claimed to be. There was a pause. She could imagine the confusion at the base. One of their nurses was somehow 2 miles out with their commanding officer, calling for help on a captured enemy radio. It must have seemed impossible. Watchdog Actual came back on the channel. Medic 3 authentication confirmed. Be advised, Raptor flight is 8 minutes out. Can you hold? Over. Katie looked at the approaching gunships. They were maybe 30 seconds away now, lining up for their attack run. She keyed the transmit button. Negative, Watchdog. Hostiles arriving in 30 seconds. I will mark target with smoke. Tell Raptor to come in hot and fast, over. She tried to sound calm and professional, but her voice cracked on the last word. There was a brief pause before Watchdog responded. Understood, Medic 3. Raptor flight is pushing maximum speed. Hold on, Watchdog out, 8 minutes. Katie had to survive 8 minutes against military gunships with nothing but a sidearm and determination. She crawled back to Hayes and positioned herself over his body, using her own body as a shield. It was a useless gesture. If the gunship scored a direct hit, they would both die instantly. But it was all she could do. She pulled out her last smoke grenade and held it ready. The gunships were on top of them now, circling like predators. They had seen her. They were assessing the target, deciding on their attack approach. Katie popped the smoke grenade and threw it as hard as she could. Gray smoke billowed out, marking their position for the Raptor pilots but also obscuring the gunship's targeting. The first gunship came in fast on a strafing run. Plasma cannons opened up, tearing through the smoke and rocks. The ground exploded around Katie. She felt impacts like hammer blows as rocks and debris flew through the air. Something hit her in the side and she felt a rib crack. The pain was white-hot but distant, like it was happening to someone else. The gunship passed over and banked for another run. Katie raised her sidearm and fired at it. The gesture was completely futile. Her pistol might as well have been a child's toy. But she fired anyway because doing something was better than doing nothing. The second gunship joined the attack, coming in from a different angle. The two ships were coordinating their assault, timing their runs to keep continuous fire on the target. Katie pressed herself flat over Hayes as plasma bolts tore through the rocks around them. One bolt hit so close that the heat flash burned her exposed arm. The pain added to the collection of injuries her body was cataloging but not processing. She was beyond pain now, operating on pure survival instinct. Her vision had narrowed to a small tunnel. Her hearing was overwhelmed by the roar of engines and weapons fire. Time stretched and compressed in strange ways. Seconds felt like hours. Minutes felt like seconds. 6 minutes until air support. Katie reloaded her sidearm with her last magazine. 7 rounds. 7 useless rounds against armored gunships. She waited for the next strafing run and fired all 7 rounds at the lead ship as it passed. None of them hit anything important. The gunship did not even seem to notice. It banked and came around for another pass. Katie had no more ammunition. She had no more smoke grenades. She had nothing left to fight with except her body between Hayes and the enemy. She positioned herself over him again and waited for the end. 4 minutes. The gunships were taking their time now, circling and firing in controlled bursts. They knew their targets were not going anywhere. They were being methodical, professional. Katie felt the impacts getting closer. Rock fragments cut her face. Plasma heat washed over her in waves. Her body was accumulating damage faster than she could track. Something was wrong with her leg. Something was wrong with her ribs. Something was wrong with her arm. Everything was wrong, but she could not stop. She could not move. She could only cover Hayes and hope that somehow some part of him would survive even if she did not. 2 minutes. The gunships lined up for what looked like a final coordinated strike. Both ships approaching from different angles, timing their runs to saturate the entire area with fire. There would be no surviving this. Katie knew it. She accepted it. She had done everything possible. She had carried Hayes 2 miles through impossible terrain. She had fought off enemy scouts. She had called for help. If she died now, at least she died knowing she had tried everything. She pressed her face against Hayes's shoulder and whispered an apology. "Sorry, sir, I tried. I really tried." Then she heard it. The most beautiful sound in the universe. The scream of human fighter jets coming in fast and low. She lifted her head and saw 2 Raptor fighters drop out of the sky like falling stars. They were moving so fast they were barely visible. Just blurs of metal and fire. Missiles streaked from their wings, tracking the Zeth gunships with perfect accuracy. The first gunship exploded in a massive fireball that lit up the sky. The second gunship tried to evade, banking hard and pouring on speed. It was too late. A burst of cannon fire from the second Raptor tore through its engines. The gunship spun out of control and crashed into the hillside half a mile away. The explosion sent a mushroom of flame and smoke into the air. The Raptor fighters circled overhead, scanning for additional threats. Katie tried to stand, to wave at them to signal that she was here and alive. Her body did not respond. She tried again and managed to get to her knees. That was as far as she could go. She collapsed next to Hayes, her hand still gripping his arm. She could hear the sound of engines approaching. A medical evacuation transport was coming in, touching down in a clearing 20 meters away. She tried to call out, but no sound came. She tried to move, but her body was finished. She had pushed it past every limit, and now it was simply done. She lay there next to Hayes and watched as medics jumped from the transport and ran toward them. The medics reached Katie and Hayes within seconds. Katie recognized Lieutenant Ben Harper, one of the other field nurses from the base. He knelt beside her and started checking her vitals while 2 other medics went to work on Colonel Hayes. Ben's face was tight with concern as he assessed Katie's condition. She tried to tell him she was fine, that he should focus on Hayes, but the words came out as a mumble. Ben ignored her protests and kept working, his hands moving with professional efficiency. Katie felt the sting of an IV going into her arm, fluids and medications flowing into her dehydrated, damaged body. The world started to feel distant and soft around the edges. They loaded Hayes onto a stretcher first. Katie watched them carry him toward the transport, moving fast but careful. She tried to see if he was still breathing, but her vision was too blurry. Ben and another medic lifted Katie onto a second stretcher. The movement sent waves of pain through her body despite whatever painkillers they had given her. She tried to stay conscious, tried to focus, but the darkness at the edges of her vision was closing in fast. The last thing she saw before passing out was the interior of the transport as they loaded her aboard. She woke up 12 hours later in the base medical facility. The first thing she felt was pain. It was everywhere, a dull ache that covered her entire body. Her back hurt, her legs hurt, her shoulders hurt. Her ribs hurt with every breath. She tried to move and immediately regretted it. A hand pressed gently on her shoulder, keeping her still. A nurse she did not recognize stood beside her bed. The nurse told her to stay calm, that she was safe, that she needed to rest. Katie ignored the advice and tried to speak. Her throat was raw and her voice came out as a croak. Hayes. Where is Colonel Hayes? The nurse smiled and told her that Hayes was alive. He was in surgery when they arrived, but the doctors had stabilized him. The biofoam Katie had applied had saved his life. He was going to recover fully. Katie felt relief wash over her so strongly that tears started running down her face. She had done it. She had actually done it. Hayes was alive. The nurse gave her something for the pain and told her to rest. Katie tried to stay awake, but the medication was strong. She drifted off into darkness again. The next time she woke up, there were people in her room. She blinked her eyes into focus and saw several alien officers standing at the foot of her bed. Commander Vresh was there, along with representatives from the other alien species. They all looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight and avoiding direct eye contact. Katie tried to sit up, but her body would not cooperate. One of the human nurses came over and adjusted her bed so she was in a more upright position. Katie looked at the alien officers and waited for them to speak. Vresh stepped forward first. His voice was different from how Katie remembered it, softer, respectful. He told her that they had reviewed the combat footage from the patrol. They had seen everything, the ambush, her running across the kill zone to reach Hayes, her carrying him 2 miles through hostile territory, her fighting off the Zeth scouts, her calling in air support with captured equipment. He said that what she had accomplished should have been impossible for a human of her size and specialization. His tone made it clear that he no longer believed humans were weak. Katie managed a weak smile and told him she was just doing her job. Vresh shook his head. He said it was far more than her job. He said that among the Kryn warriors, such an act of courage and endurance would be celebrated for generations. He performed a gesture that Katie recognized as a sign of deep respect in Kryn culture. The other alien officers followed suit, each performing their own species version of a respectful bow. Katie did not know what to say. She had never expected this kind of recognition from the aliens who had dismissed her for so long. Then Colonel Hayes entered the room. He was pale and moving carefully, but he was on his feet. His chest was wrapped in heavy bandages and he had medical monitoring equipment attached to him. He should have been in bed, but Katie knew he would not stay there. Hayes moved to her bedside and looked down at her with an expression she had never seen before. Pride mixed with gratitude, mixed with something that might have been awe. He told her that he had recommended her for the Stellar Cross, the highest military honor that humans could award. He said her actions had demonstrated courage, strength, and tactical ability under impossible circumstances. He said she had saved not just his life, but the lives of everyone on that patrol by bringing in air support. Katie felt overwhelmed. The Stellar Cross was not something people like her received. It was for combat heroes, for soldiers who charged machine gun nests or held impossible positions against overwhelming odds. It was not for nurses who just did their jobs. She tried to say this, but Hayes cut her off. He told her firmly that she had done far more than her job. He said that carrying a 210-pound man 2 miles through hostile territory while wounded was not normal. Calling in an airstrike with enemy equipment while under fire from gunships was not normal. Fighting off enemy scouts with a sidearm while protecting a casualty was not normal. What she had done was extraordinary by any measure. The alien officers agreed. They told Katie that they had learned something important about humans. They had thought humans were weak because they were small, because they had medics and nurses instead of only warriors, because they appeared fragile compared to other species. They had not understood that human strength came from determination and refusal to quit. It came from the ability to push past any limit when something important was at stake. It came from the willingness to suffer for others. These were strengths that did not show on the surface but were more powerful than any physical advantage. Katie listened to all of this and did not know how to respond. She had not been thinking about proving anything when she carried Hayes. She had not been thinking about human reputation or alien opinions. She had just been trying to save someone who mattered to her, someone who had helped her become the medic she was. She had been operating on loyalty and debt, and the simple fact that leaving him behind was not acceptable. If that made her a hero, then every medic in every war in human history was a hero, because they all did the same thing every single day. She tried to explain this, but the words came out wrong. Hayes understood anyway. He told her that was exactly the point. Humans had always been like this. They had always refused to quit. They had always protected each other. They had always pushed past impossible limits when someone they cared about was in danger. That was not weakness. That was the very best of what humanity offered to the galaxy. The aliens had just never bothered to notice before. Now they would never forget. Katie spent 6 weeks recovering from her injuries. The doctors cataloged the damage with a mixture of amazement and concern. Severe muscle damage throughout her back and legs, 3 cracked ribs, a partially torn ligament in her left knee, second-degree burns on her right arm, a concussion, dehydration so severe it should have killed her, cuts and bruises covering most of her body. The doctors said she had pushed her body beyond any reasonable limit. They said most people would have collapsed after the first mile. They said she was lucky to be alive. Katie told them she did not feel very lucky, but she understood their point. The story of what she had done spread through the base like wildfire. Human soldiers treated her with a new level of respect that made her uncomfortable. Alien soldiers who had barely acknowledged her existence before now nodded when she passed. Some even saluted, which was strange because she was just a lieutenant, and many of them outranked her. The attention was overwhelming. Katie had never wanted to be famous or celebrated. She just wanted to do her job and help people. Now everywhere she went, people stared and whispered and pointed. It was exhausting. Colonel Hayes recovered faster than his doctors predicted. He was back to light duty after 4 weeks and full duty after 6. The first thing he did upon returning to command was reorganize how the base treated its medical personnel. He issued orders that all medical staff were to be included in tactical briefings. He mandated that alien commanders had to coordinate with human medical officers on all patrol planning. He made it clear that anyone who dismissed or disrespected medical personnel would answer to him personally. The alien commanders grumbled, but they complied. Hayes had earned enough respect that even the Kryn listened to him now. The award ceremony was held 8 weeks after the ambush. Representatives from all 5 species attended, along with human military brass who had traveled from Earth specifically for the event. Katie stood in her dress uniform, still feeling the aches in her body but standing straight anyway. Hayes read the citation for the Stellar Cross, detailing everything she had done. The words sounded strange to Katie, like he was describing someone else. Some fictional hero from a story, not a scared nurse who had simply refused to let someone die. But she accepted the medal with grace and said the things that were expected of her. She thanked her fellow soldiers. She thanked her commanding officers. She dedicated the award to all the medics who had come before her, and all who would come after. After the ceremony, alien officers approached her one by one to offer their respects. Commander Vresh told her that the Kryn had a saying about warriors who proved themselves beyond doubt. Once proven, forever honored. He said Katie was now considered proven by Kryn standards. She would always be welcomed among Kryn warriors as an equal. The Vex representative performed a complex clicking pattern that Katie's translator rendered as highest recognition of tactical excellence. The Dalmar gave her a four-armed embrace that nearly cracked her still-healing ribs. Even the usually stoic Torgash acknowledged her with what their species considered high praise, a simple nod of profound respect. But the real change was not in ceremonies or medals. It was in how the coalition forces operated. Human medical personnel were now integrated into every aspect of military operations. Their advice was sought on planning. Their expertise was respected. When human medics said something was important, people listened. Other human specialists started to be taken more seriously too. Engineers, communications experts, logistics officers. The entire human contingent benefited from the shift in perception that Katie's actions had triggered. Katie went on to serve 3 more tours after Epsilon Prime. She trained a new generation of combat medics and established protocols that saved countless lives. She wrote manuals on trauma care under fire. She developed new techniques for casualty evacuation. She became one of the most respected medical officers in the human military. But no matter how high she rose in rank or how many more medals she earned, people always remembered her as the nurse who carried her colonel 2 miles and called down thunder on her enemies. Years later, when she was finally promoted to major and given command of all combat medical operations for the human expeditionary forces, someone asked her about that day on Epsilon Prime. They wanted to know how she had done it, how she had carried Hayes that far, how she had kept going when her body was breaking down, how she had found the strength to do the impossible. Katie thought about it for a long moment before answering. She said it was not really about strength at all. It was about refusing to accept the alternative. Leaving Hayes behind was not acceptable. Giving up was not acceptable. Dying was not acceptable, not while someone needed her. So she had just kept moving, one step at a time. Not because she was strong or brave or special, just because there was no other choice that she could live with. The person asking the question did not seem satisfied with that answer. They wanted something more dramatic, more heroic. But Katie had learned over the years that real heroism was rarely dramatic in the moment. It was usually just people doing what needed to be done because nobody else was going to do it. It was the choice to try even when success seemed impossible. It was the refusal to quit even when quitting would be easier. That was what humans brought to the galaxy, not superior technology or tactics or strength, just the stubborn determination to keep trying no matter what. The galaxy had learned that lesson on Epsilon Prime. The story of Katie Morris became required reading in military academies across a dozen species. It was used as a teaching example of how to properly assess an ally's capabilities. It demonstrated that strength came in many forms and should never be judged by appearance alone. Young soldiers from every species learned about the human nurse who had proven that determination and courage could overcome physical limitations. They learned that medics were not weak support personnel, but often the strongest people on the battlefield. Katie eventually retired after 20 years of service. She settled on a colony world and opened a medical clinic. She trained civilian doctors and nurses. She gave occasional lectures at military schools. She lived a quiet life, mostly forgotten by everyone except those who had served with her. But in military bases across human space, in alien command centers and coalition headquarters, her story lived on. Pictures of her carrying Colonel Hayes hung in medical facilities. The Stellar Cross she had earned was replicated and given to other medics who showed exceptional courage. Her techniques were still taught. Her protocols were still followed, and whenever someone dismissed humans as weak or fragile, whenever someone suggested that medics were not real soldiers, whenever someone claimed that small people could not do big things, veterans would tell them about Katie Morris, about the field nurse who had carried a full-grown man 2 miles through enemy territory, about the medic who had fought off enemy scouts and called in air support under fire, about the tiny human woman who had done the impossible because she refused to accept that it was impossible. They would tell that story and remind people that humans were never to be underestimated. That being small did not mean being weak. That being a healer did not mean being helpless. Katie Morris had wanted to prove that she was not just a field nurse. In the end, she had proven something far more important. She had proven that being a field nurse meant being strong enough to save others even when it seemed impossible. She had proven that human strength came from determination and loyalty, and the refusal to give up. She had proven that sometimes the strongest warriors were the ones who carried others when they could not carry themselves. And she had proven it in a way that the galaxy would never forget. One painful step at a time, with a dying man on her shoulders and enemy fire all around. She had shown the universe what humans were truly capable of when they decided that something mattered more than their own survival. That was the real story of Katie Morris. Not the medals or the ceremonies or the recognition, just a nurse who had refused to let someone die. Just a human who had done the impossible because the alternative was unacceptable. Just a woman who had proven that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is simply refuse to quit. And in doing so, she had changed how an entire galaxy saw her species. Not bad for someone who was just a field nurse.